Story number 1. The Whispering Snowfall. I was never one to believe in ghost stories, especially not the kind involving lost cabins in the middle of nowhere. But if I've learned anything from the events of one fateful winter weekend, it's that the line between superstition and reality can blur under the weight of howling winds and swirling snow. Sometimes, the things we dismiss as mere legend are the very truths waiting for us at the end of a dark forest trail. It happened in the Adirondacks, in a forgotten corner of upstate New York where dense pines and ancient rocks hibernate beneath sheets of ice. Back in college, my friends and I were inseparable. There was Alex, the sarcastic pragmatist; Jade, the adventurous soul with a penchant for questionable ideas; Malcolm, the quiet observer whose eyes seemed to register every detail; and me, just another restless grad student craving a break from city lights. We hadn't been together in years, life pulling us in separate directions. So when Jade proposed a winter getaway, none of us hesitated. We craved a reunion, an escape from the grind. The idea was simple: spend a weekend at an old log cabin rumored to date back to the 19th century. A friend of Jade's family supposedly owned the place, though how they'd come to possess it was unclear. The rent was cheap, the scenery promised to be breathtaking, and we figured the isolation would do us good. If only we'd known. We set out on a Friday morning, leaving Manhattan's chaos behind and trading it for the winter plains, the horizon layered in whites and grays. The wind whistled across the windshield as if trying to warn us. By mid-afternoon, we'd left the main roads behind, the car's tires crunching over uneven gravel and frosted pine needles. Jagged peaks of the Adirondacks framed the sky, stark and imposing, like silent sentinels watching us approach. Jade had the directions scrawled on a piece of notebook paper. No Google Maps signaled this deep in the forest. The instructions led us down a narrow track that twisted through thick stands of evergreens, their branches sagging under the weight of snow. Occasionally, we'd spot a faded wooden sign with some old family name, but mostly we drove in an eerie silence, the hush of the wilderness pressing in. Alex, in the passenger seat, tried to lighten the mood with jokes about Bigfoot or the Wendigo. Malcolm contributed the occasional MMM, while Jade navigated with a furrowed brow. I focused on driving carefully along the slippery lane. A sense of mounting tension formed a knot in my gut, though I wrote it off as city stress. We'd come for a break, no reason to brood. Eventually, the path ended in a clearing. The cabin stood on a gentle rise, surrounded by a ring of towering pines. A relic from another time, it exuded an austere charm: walls of thick logs, a steep roof designed to shed heavy snow, and a small stone chimney. Gray smoke curled lazily, which startled me at first. Had someone lit a fire in anticipation of our arrival? Jade assured us her contact must have come earlier in the day to warm the place. We bundled up, unloaded our bags, and trudged to the door. The wind picked up, a sudden gust that flung snow in our faces. I fumbled with the key Jade handed me, the metal cold enough to sting. The old wooden door creaked open, revealing a dim interior lit only by a flicker of firelight from a modest stone hearth. Inside, the floorboards groaned beneath our boots, the weight of decades, maybe centuries, settled into the timber. The walls were thick logs, chinked with aged mortar. A bearskin rug sprawled in front of the fireplace, its glassy eyes staring vacantly at the rafters. Flickering firelight cast moving shadows across shelves lined with dusty books and old hunting trophies. The air smelled faintly of pine resin and something else, oldness, like a memory that refused to die. Cozy, Jade said with a grin, but her eyes darted around as if expecting some hidden occupant to jump out. I'll check the bedrooms, Malcolm volunteered, taking the narrow hallway to the left. The rest of us explored the main room, discovering an old dining table, a few mismatched chairs, and a rickety staircase leading to what looked like a loft. I wonder how old this place really is, I mused aloud. I trailed my hand across a rough log beam overhead. In some spots, the timber was etched with faint carvings, symbols or patterns that had worn away with time. Practically ancient, Alex muttered. He lifted a dusty photo frame from the mantel, squinting at the black and white snapshot. It showed a group of men in frontier attire standing outside this very cabin. Their expressions were grim, eyes reflecting some unspoken weight. No date, no names, just an echo of a lost era. Shortly, Malcolm returned. Bedrooms are small but neat, he reported. One even has an old rocking chair in the corner. Feels like stepping into a different century back there. We assigned ourselves rooms, unpacked, and started dinner. Jade rummaged through the kitchen cupboards, finding only a few rusty utensils and ancient jars. Good thing we brought our own supplies. We decided on a simple meal, soup and sandwiches. By the time we ate, the sun was sinking, its light filtered through snow-laden clouds, painting the sky in hushed shades of lavender and gray. Darkness settles quickly in the winter forest. By 6 o'clock, the windows were black mirrors, reflecting the glow of our lanterns. A sense of comforting isolation washed over us as we sipped hot chocolate by the fire, chatting about old times and future plans. The cabin's warmth and the flicker of flames lulled us into a comfortable drowsiness. Sometime after 8, the wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters and sending a low moan through the rafters. The sudden gust made the fire dance, casting wild shadows across the walls. Malcolm got up to add another log. That's when I first heard it, a faint crunch above us, like footsteps treading over the roof. I stiffened. "You guys hear that?" I asked, heart already thumping. "Hear what?" Jade said, pausing mid-sip. "Footsteps on the roof. Could be pine cones falling, maybe." We listened, but the noise didn't repeat. Alex shrugged. "Probably a branch scraping. This place is old. Everything's going to creak." I tried to shake it off. After all, we were deep in the woods, raccoons or squirrels might scurry across. Yet something about it felt heavier. More deliberate. We resumed talking, eventually drifting into laughter over silly college memories. But beneath our banter lay a certain unease, a collective awareness of being alone in an ancient cabin surrounded by miles of wintry forest. The wind howled, stirring up the snow outside. By midnight, we decided to turn in, each retreating to our rooms with flashlights in hand. My room was small, with a single bed topped by a patchwork quilt. The walls exuded the same musty odor that permeated the cabin, like old books and pine tar. I kicked off my boots, peeled off layers of clothing, and slid under the covers, hoping for a deep sleep. But the minute I closed my eyes, an unsettling thought crossed my mind. Who lit the fire for us earlier? The room was so cold now. Did that person leave, or were they still around? I tried not to dwell on it. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me. I woke to the sound of someone frantically thumping on the front door. My heart lurched as I sat up, disoriented by the pale morning light streaming through the frosted window. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I heard Jade's voice rising in alarm. The corridor was cold. I threw on a sweater and rushed to the main room, where Jade, Alex, and Malcolm stood by the front door. Beyond the window panes, I could see a wall of white. Snow had piled so high during the night that it barricaded half the entrance. "I can't get it open," Jade said, her breath steaming in the frosty air. She pushed her shoulder against the door, but it barely budged. The windows offered no comfort. Outside, drifts reached halfway up the glass. It must have snowed relentlessly through the night, burying the road back to civilization. Even if we had the best four-wheel drive, we wouldn't make it out without a serious plow. There was no cell service, no landline. We were trapped. "Well," Malcolm said slowly, "we have food for a couple days, at least. We can wait it out. Maybe we'll get a break in the weather." Despite our anxiety, we agreed this was the only rational plan. We spent the morning clearing what snow we could from the doors and windows, but it was a losing battle. The wind kept sweeping more drifts against the walls. That afternoon, Jade and I ventured outside through a rear door that opened into a small covered porch. We donned our thickest coats, determined to see if there was a path through the pines. Our boots sank knee-deep as we trudged around the cabin. The frigid air stung my lungs, and the swirling snow made me squint. The forest looked unreal, each branch weighted with ice, each trunk an imposing pillar in a cathedral of white. The roof was heavily blanketed, sagging in places. No footprints, no sign of visitors. Just an unending expanse of whiteness. We circled back inside, half frozen, concluding there was no easy escape. That evening, we huddled by the fire again, determined to keep our spirits up. We played a few board games we'd found in a dusty trunk, Scrabble, Monopoly missing half the money. But the mood was subdued. The howling wind outside felt like some primeval force, pushing us deeper into isolation. Around 9, Malcolm began rummaging through the old books on the shelf. He found a journal, its cover cracked leather. The yellowed pages contained neat handwriting that dated back to the 1800s. We gathered around, reading snippets. January 17, 1859. The snows are thick, but the flame keeps us safe. This land wants us gone. Last night, I heard them chanting among the pines, though the rest claim it was just the wind. Our eyes met, unsettled. Malcolm turned more pages. February 2nd, 1859. We performed the rite at dusk. Smeared with ash and bone dust, we prayed to the forest spirits. They demand blood. I fear we have awakened something older than these mountains. A hush fell upon us, the crackle of the fire seeming louder now. Is this for real? Jade muttered, her voice trembling. Alex snorted, trying to sound skeptical, but he looked just as uneasy. Continuing to skim, Malcolm found references to ritual circles, offerings, and the forest watchers. The final entry read, February 16, 1859. The night air hums with laughter no human throat can make. We have lost James. Found his boots near the clearing, but no trace of him. I see eyes in the dark, gleaming with hunger. This cabin is no sanctuary, it is a prison. May God forgive us for what we have done. Malcolm shut the journal abruptly. No one spoke. Outside, the wind whistled, as if echoing a laughter we couldn't fully hear. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night. I dreamed of a circle of robed figures chanting in a language I'd never heard before. Their eyes were hidden beneath hoods, but I sensed an ancient malice behind the cloth. Beyond them, the forest pulsed with a heartbeat, each thump rattling the bones in my chest. I jolted awake to the sound of that same crunch on the roof. This time, it was unmistakable, deliberate footsteps scraping against the icy shingles. I held my breath. The cabin was dark, except for the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. I dared not move, each second thick with dread. Then came a hushed cackle, like a person trying to stifle a giggle. It drifted from outside, or maybe from the eaves. My heart pounded so loudly I worried it might wake the others. The footsteps moved slowly across the length of the roof, culminating in a thud above my room. I stared at the ceiling, paralyzed by fear, as if expecting the boards to give way and reveal some horrific figure. By the time morning arrived, I was exhausted. Over breakfast, canned beans and stale granola, Malcolm confessed he heard it too. So had Jade. Alex tried to dismiss it as tree branches or settling snow, but his tone lacked conviction. We decided to search the attic, half expecting to find a raccoon or other wildlife. Jade and I volunteered, flashlights in hand. The attic hatch was in the hallway, a small square panel. We climbed a rickety ladder into a cramped space that smelled of dust and old timber. Piles of old crates lay scattered, some marked with archaic symbols. We found no critter, no footprints, nothing but stale air and cobwebs. My stomach churned with unease. Jade opened one crate, revealing relics that looked like ritual objects, candles fashioned from animal fat, a stone bowl stained dark, lumps of dried herbs. The air grew thick with a sense of foreboding, and we hurried back down. By mid-afternoon, the snow outside reached levels that made even our short exploration impossible. We were thoroughly stuck. We tried rationing our food, realizing we might be here longer than anticipated. The skies were leaden, threatening more snow. None of us voiced the obvious question, what if we run out of supplies? The cabin's atmosphere felt charged. Subtle knocks and scraping sounds became a constant background. Sometimes we'd hear fleeting laughter in the wind, or whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Was it just our collective imagination playing tricks on us? Desperate for answers, we turned back to the journal. We read deeper into the entries describing how a small group of settlers had once lived here. They performed a sacred ritual each winter to appease the forest spirits. According to the scribbles, failing to complete the ritual led to dire consequences, disappearances, madness, even death. And apparently, the final line suggested the ritual was never completed that last winter in 1859. We're tied to this somehow, Jade breathed. The place, the timing, maybe that's why we keep hearing things. Maybe it's calling to us. Alex snorted again, but his voice shook. You can't honestly believe that. It's just an old legend. If something truly malevolent was here, it would have acted by now. Maybe it's toying with us, Malcolm offered grimly. I remembered something from earlier. Jade had said this cabin belonged to a distant contact of her family. What did your friend tell you about this place, Jade? Did they mention any of this history? Jade shook her head, frowning. They just said we could stay here for cheap, that it's usually empty and not many folks go up. God, do you think they knew? The question hung in the frigid air, unanswered. That night, the storm raged. The wind battered the cabin, making the walls groan in protest. Our conversation died out, replaced by tense silence. Sleep proved impossible. Around midnight, Malcolm, Jade, and I gathered in the living room. The fire crackled, pushing back the darkness. We spoke in hushed tones, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. We heard the footsteps again, several sets this time. They crisscrossed the roof, circled the cabin's perimeter, sometimes pausing near the windows. I caught glimpses of shapes through the frosty panes, tall figures drifting among the trees, faces indistinct, limbs oddly elongated. Laughter, soft, mocking, drifted on the wind. Alex, typically the skeptic, turned ashen. He peered out the window, scanning the darkness for some rational explanation. Suddenly, the glass fogged with condensation, as if a warm breath exhaled from outside. A faint outline of a handprint appeared, fingers grotesquely long, pressed against the window for a moment before vanishing. We recoiled. Jade stifled a scream, while Malcolm gripped a fireplace poker in trembling hands. I felt an overpowering dread, a sense that we were caught in the jaws of something far beyond our understanding. Something that had lingered here for centuries, feeding on those who trespassed. We barricaded ourselves in the living room, pushing furniture against the doors and windows. The pounding footsteps continued into the small hours, punctuated by giggles that sounded more like choking sobs. Eventually, we heard them fade into the woods, the night receding with a final ghostly chuckle. Come morning, no footprints marked the snow. No evidence that anything had been there. The only sign was the faint handprint, its outline etched in frost. We decided to read the journal in full, searching for a way out. Piecing the entries together, we discovered the settlers had come under the influence of a local wise woman, a witch, the townsfolk would have called her, who claimed to have knowledge of appeasing the Adirondack spirits. She instructed them to offer a sacrifice each winter, a ritual completed by chanting ancient verses and burning an effigy under the moonlight. But in 1859, the settlers refused. They tried to leave. The snows trapped them. One by one, they vanished until no one remained. It hit us, the footsteps, the laughter, the shapes in the forest, they might be the remnants of those lost souls, or the spirits summoned by the incomplete ritual. And we, unknowing visitors, had stumbled into their domain. That afternoon, Jade found a locked chest in a back closet. Inside were more ritual objects, a small figurine shaped like a man, carved from dark wood, a ring of twisted branches bound with sinew, and a tattered piece of parchment covered in runic symbols. We recognized some of the marks from the journal. The instructions seemed to detail a final ceremony to release the spirits. The parchment was fragile, its ink faded, but we discerned enough to guess it involved burying the wooden figurine under a tree near the cabin, lighting a special fire, and reciting an incantation at dusk. Should we do it? Malcolm asked quietly, as though the cabin's walls might overhear. Alex stared at the floor. Do we even have a choice? None of us believed wholeheartedly in spells or ghosts. Yet the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. We decided to attempt the ritual that evening, hoping it would break the cycle and let us go free. All day, the wind howled and the snow pelted the windows. Nonetheless, we busied ourselves gathering wood, clearing a small space near a gnarled pine behind the cabin. According to the parchment, we needed to mark a circle with branches and place the figurine in the center. Then, at twilight, recite the incantation while lighting the effigy aflame. We set up a ring of logs around the makeshift altar for warmth. We had only a few matches left, so we had to be careful. Tension crackled in the air like static electricity. Even the cabin felt charged, its old timbers seeming to pulse with an unseen heartbeat. At sunset, the sky darkened into a bruise of purples and blacks. A raw chill descended. We donned heavy coats, hats, gloves, anything to keep the cold at bay. As we prepared to head outside, that sense of being watched grew suffocating. Through the windows, we spotted tall silhouettes drifting between the pines, circling like sharks. "Let's get this over with," Jade whispered, face pale but determined. We trudged through knee-deep snow to the designated spot behind the cabin. The wind roared, whipping snow into our eyes. Malcolm and Alex carried the firewood, Jade clutched the wooden effigy, and I had the parchment with the incantation. Under the towering pine, we formed a circle of branches. Jade placed the effigy in the center, carefully pouring a bit of lamp oil onto it. I read the words from the parchment, struggling to form the archaic syllables over chattering teeth. "Spirits of the ancient wood, bound by oath and blood, we return what was taken, that your wrath be forsaken." The wind surged, nearly snuffing out our lantern. I kept reading, voice trembling, while Alex struck a match. The flame sputtered in the gale, but we shielded it with our hands. The moment the match touched the effigy, a brilliant flare ignited. Sparks danced upward, carried by the storm. The silhouettes appeared at the edge of our circle. Dozens of them, or maybe more. Their forms wavered like living shadows, eyes gleaming with a pale luminescence. They stood silent, watching. My breath caught in my throat as I finished the final line. "Return to dust, by night's decree. Release this land, now set us free." The effigy crackled, flames licking up its carved limbs. A low moan emanated from the forest, as though the trees themselves groaned in pain or relief. The shapes pressed closer, their faces distorted by the flickering light, half human, half nightmare. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The storm paused, the wind dropping to a dead calm. Then a wall of sound erupted. It was not just wind, but laughter mingled with screams, a chorus of anguish spanning centuries. The ground trembled beneath our feet. Snow cascaded from the pine branches, burying the circle. We cowered, huddled together, as the tall shapes swirled around us. Some hovered just out of reach, their mouths open in silent wails. Others reached out long, spindly hands. I felt my vision swim, terror strangling me. The ritual was supposed to release them. Had we failed? Then, through the chaos, I noticed the effigy's flames shift to a brilliant blue-white glow. A crack tore through the figurine's center. The circle of branches we'd laid out burst into light, sparks shooting skyward like a miniature meteor shower. The shapes recoiled, shriveling back. The unearthly chorus grew deafening, building to a crescendo that rattled my teeth. Suddenly, the moaning stopped. The shapes flickered one by one, dissolving into spirals of ash that vanished on the wind. The night went silent. Only the soft crackle of the dying fire remained. We stood there, dumbfounded, hearts pounding. It was as if the forest had exhaled. Lightning forked across the sky. Then came the thunder, rolling over the mountains like distant drums. A final gust of wind scattered the embers, leaving us in darkness. Our limbs shook not just from the cold, but from the enormity of what we'd witnessed. Dawn arrived with the first break in the clouds we'd seen in days. The storm had passed, and the morning sun glistened on fresh snow. We hurried to check the roads. Miraculously, the drifts were lower. It seemed we might be able to drive out with some effort. The sense of oppression that had hung over the cabin was gone, replaced by a tentative serenity. We packed our belongings in silence, still reeling from the night's events. No one tried to rationalize or dismiss it. We just wanted out of that place, away from the memories that would forever haunt us. Jade left a note for her contact, apologizing for any damage. We suspected they knew more about the cabin's history than they'd let on. By noon, we managed to dig out a path wide enough for the SUV. The forest, so menacing hours before, seemed almost benign under the clear winter sky. The trees sparkled, the air crisp and bright. As we pulled onto the main road, I glanced back at the cabin. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. The old logs looked sun-bleached, as though decades had passed overnight. A shadow flickered in the doorway, my heart leapt. But it was only a trick of the light, perhaps. We never spoke much about what happened in the Adirondack cabin. Oh, we stayed in touch, of course, texting and meeting occasionally. But whenever the conversation skirted that weekend, we'd grow quiet, changing the subject to something mundane. An unspoken pact formed, never go back. For me, nightmares persisted, a nightly parade of hooded figures, arcane chanting, footsteps on the roof. Weeks later, Jade contacted the so-called friend who'd recommended the cabin. She demanded an explanation, but the conversation was cryptic. The person admitted to hearing rumors about a family curse dating back to the 1800s. They claimed they had no idea it was that serious. Jade hung up, furious. She stopped responding to them entirely. Life went on, as it does. But on cold winter nights, when the wind howls outside my apartment window, I sometimes think I hear faint laughter in the gusts. A part of me wonders if the ritual truly set the spirits free, or if it merely sated them for now. The Adirondack forests have stood for eons, bearing witness to secrets older than any human settlement. We might have escaped, but the land retains its memory. Should another lost traveler stumble upon that cabin, the snows might rise again, footsteps might echo once more upon the roof, and the ancient laughter might beckon from the pines. Because evil doesn't vanish, it waits, patient as the seasons, for the next soul foolish enough to awaken it. And if, one day, you find yourself drawn by the allure of a quaint log cabin in a silent winter wood, think twice. Because sometimes, a cheap weekend getaway comes at a price no one should have to pay. And the whispering snowfall carries more than just the hush of the wind, it carries the echoes of those who were lost, and the promise of an old ritual that might demand new blood. Story number 2. The Curse of Winchester Mansion. I never thought I'd find myself shivering in a corridor of the Winchester Mystery House after midnight, half convinced that something in the darkness was breathing down my neck. I'd always brushed off ghost stories and old superstitions, just the relics of gullible minds and tourist gimmicks. But that was before the night the mansion chose me and my friends to be its unwitting victims. Before the locked doors rattled on their own, before the voices whispered secrets meant to remain buried. Now, I'm no longer sure where the line between the living and the dead truly lies. We were a group of 5 history majors from a local university near San Jose, each of us hungry for something more than just dusty textbooks and secondhand stories. There was me and Callie, the so-called rational one in the group, plus Gabe, who had a habit of scoffing at everything he deemed corny, Reggie, quiet but curious, Erica, whose conspiratorial mind latched onto rumors like glue, and Andre, our adventurous ringleader, always the first to propose a reckless plan. And so it happened that, on a chilly Friday afternoon, we found ourselves at the Winchester Mystery House, studying for a paper we planned to write on eccentric American architecture and cultural legends. Of course, what started as a sincere academic interest soon twisted into a reckless mission to explore the sealed-off sections of the mansion, those famous hidden rooms and secret passageways that most visitors never get to see. I heard Sarah Winchester believed these rooms kept evil spirits at bay, Erica whispered as we stood in a dusty corner of the mansion, away from the guided tour. She was so terrified of the ghosts of those killed by Winchester rifles that she built corridors leading to nowhere, windows that opened into walls, and a seance room to communicate with the dead. Gabe rolled his eyes. "And you believe that?" Andre smirked. "Maybe not. But there's a rumor about a whole wing that's been walled off for decades. The owners keep it locked because of safety hazards, or so they claim. I say we check it out." Reggie's eyes darted around. "We could get in real trouble for trespassing, you know." "Come on," I said, my pulse already quickening at the thought. "We're historians, right? Documenting hidden spaces is practically our job. We'll be careful." And that's how we ended up sneaking away from the official tour, dodging staff in quiet corridors, and finally descending a narrow flight of stairs that led into the house's lesser-known levels. It's not hard to get lost in Winchester Mystery House. The labyrinth of halls, staircases, and doorways feels designed to baffle any sense of direction. Spiral staircases abruptly end at the ceiling, doors open onto sheer drops. We carried flashlights, careful to keep them dim so as not to attract attention. Eventually, Erica found a heavy wooden door with a rusted lock. A sign read, "Restricted area, do not enter." "Must be it," Andre whispered, excitement lighting up his face. We'd come prepared. Gabe produced a small pry bar from his backpack. He swore he only carried it because we might need it for research. The lock was old. After some wiggling and a muffled snap, the latch gave way. The door opened with a groan, exhaling a stale gust of air that reeked of dust, old wood, and something like mildew. A twinge of unease bloomed in my gut, but I was too curious to turn back. We stepped inside, forming a line of cautious explorers. The corridor beyond was dark, its walls decorated with peeling wallpaper from some bygone era. At the far end was a single, flickering light bulb that cast elongated shadows on the floor. "I thought the electricity was off in these unused sections," Reggie muttered. "Guess not," Gabe said, checking the overhead fixture. "Maybe a caretaker used this area once or forgot to cut power entirely." The hush around us was thick. Every footstep felt intrusive, as if we were disturbing a watchful presence. Despite the musty closeness of the air, I sensed a faint breeze that sent chills coursing up my arms. It didn't help that I kept imagining shapes shifting just out of sight whenever I turned my head. We pressed forward until the corridor opened into a wide, neglected foyer. A pair of cracked mirrors faced each other across the room, doubling and redoubling our reflections into infinity. A single door stood to the left, sealed by planks nailed in place. To the right, a spiral staircase curved upward, disappearing into shadow. Erica shined her flashlight on the boarded door. "Looks like no one wants us going in there." "But that's exactly where we need to go," Andre said, flashing a grin. Before I could argue, he was already prying at the boards, sending up squeals of nails. The wood gave way with disturbing ease. The door behind the boards was unlocked. It opened onto a dusty, high-ceilinged room lined with shelves of old books. The odor of ancient paper enveloped us, tinged with a faint chemical smell, varnish or old adhesives, maybe. I raised my flashlight to illuminate row after row of leather-bound volumes, many unlabeled. In the center of the floor was a circular pattern, etched into the wood like a bizarre mandala. The design reminded me of an occult symbol, intricate circles within circles, crossed by lines and strange runes. "Whoa," Gabe said, stepping carefully around it. "Creepy much?" Erica crouched by the etched pattern, running her fingers along a series of odd markings that looked almost like letters, but not from any alphabet I recognized. "If we decipher this, maybe we'll figure out what it means." Andre lifted one of the books from the nearest shelf. His eyes widened. "Guys, these are all hand-copied. Some look centuries old." I joined him, heart pounding with excitement and dread. The text on the page was spidery and precise, full of archaic script and swirling embellishments. The language looked like Latin or a cousin of it. I caught glimpses of words like mortis, adversus, ritus, something about spirits and rituals, perhaps. My Latin was too rusty for a proper translation. Reggie hovered near the door, glancing over his shoulder. "We shouldn't be here," he said. "I've got a bad feeling." "Just a few minutes," I insisted, scanning more pages. This was a historian's dream, original documents from who knew what era, locked away from the public. "We can document, photograph, then leave." Gabe fished out his phone for pictures, but as soon as he snapped the first shot, the overhead light flickered, flaring into harsh brightness before going out with a pop. We shrieked in unison, left in darkness. Our flashlights carved jittery beams across the room. "Light bulb must have died," Andre said, trying to sound unconcerned. But I heard the waver in his voice. We agreed to wrap up quickly, but then, we heard it. A soft thump echoed from overhead, like someone dropping a heavy object on the floor above. Then another. Thump, thump. Reggie swallowed hard. "We're not alone." We gathered at the threshold of the forbidden room, reluctant to separate yet compelled to find the source of the noise. Andre led the way back into the corridor, shining his flashlight upward toward the spiral staircase. Thump, thump. It continued, rhythmic, almost like footsteps. "That's coming from upstairs," Erica whispered. We ascended, each step creaking beneath us. The stairwell was dangerously narrow, forcing us single file. My palms felt clammy on the banister. Halfway up, I paused to catch my breath, peering into the gloom above. That's when something flickered at the top of the stairs, a fleeting shape that seemed to vanish the moment my flashlight touched it. I froze. Did anyone else see? Shoo, Andre hissed. At the top, we emerged into a cramped hallway with walls that looked unfinished, as if mid-renovation. Exposed wooden frames formed a skeleton around us. Here, the temperature dropped noticeably, my breath puffed in small clouds. Hello? Gabe called, voice echoing strangely. Anyone there? No response. We turned a corner to discover a short corridor ending in 3 doors, each unmarked. All were closed. Silence reigned, broken only by our ragged breathing. Andre reached for the nearest doorknob. Locked. The second door was locked too. The third, however, swung open with a plaintive squeak, revealing a small, empty room illuminated by a single overhead bulb that flickered like a dying candle. At first glance, it seemed unimpressive: blank walls, a single window boarded from the outside, and a dusty wooden floor. Then I spotted something in the corner, a pile of old clothes. No. On closer inspection, it was a tattered cloak, stained with blotches of what looked suspiciously like dried crimson. Beneath it, an old photograph lay face down. I stepped forward, compelled by some morbid curiosity. Scooping up the photo, I wiped away the dust. 5 people stood in a row, a younger Sarah Winchester, if my guess was correct, flanked by 4 others, 2 men, 2 women, all with strained expressions. Behind them loomed part of the mansion. Their eyes seemed to burn with a weird intensity, and in the background, almost invisible, was the faint outline of that same circular symbol we'd seen carved into the floor below. How is that possible? I whispered. That symbol is over 100 years old, at least. Erica bit her lip. Maybe older. Maybe a lot older. The overhead bulb gave one last sputter and died, plunging us into blackness. From the hallway came a ragged sigh, like the exhalation of a figure standing just out of sight. We fled back to the main corridor in a confused panic, hearts pounding like war drums. Once we reached the relative familiarity of the restricted foyer, we tried to regroup, shining flashlights at each other's pale faces. We have to get out, Reggie insisted. Forget everything. There's something wrong here. Andre wrestled with his fear, jaw clenched. We came for the truth. We found it. Let's not bail before we at least confirm. A sudden slam cut him off. The door behind us, the entrance to the forbidden room, had just shut itself with brute force. Gabe spun to test the handle. It wouldn't budge, as though sealed from the inside. Then we heard slow scraping, like heavy furniture being dragged across the floor, followed by a noise that might have been a laugh. Or a sob. My legs felt like rubber. I can't do this. We're trapped if we can't get back that way. The main route's behind that door. Erica pressed a hand to her forehead. There has to be another exit. This house has endless doors. Maybe we can circle around. So we stumbled deeper into the restricted corridors, hoping to loop back. The architecture seemed to shift around us, the layout folding on itself as though walls had moved. Each hallway blurred into the next, each door leading to more confusion. We passed half-built staircases that ended abruptly, doors that opened to bricked-in walls. Claustrophobia set in. My flashlight revealed only dust motes dancing in stale air. We tried door after door. Most were locked or led nowhere. The few that opened revealed bizarre storage spaces, some filled with old furniture, others just empty. We turned a corner and arrived at yet another corridor, this one with shattered windows lining one side. A chilly breeze sneaked in, stirring the rotted curtains. Beyond the broken glass, I caught a glimpse of the courtyard below, faintly illuminated by external floodlights the staff must have left on. If I shouted, would the security guards even hear me? Look, Gabe said, shining his flashlight on the floor. Footprints. A line of dusty footprints, shaped like bare feet, led from the corridor we'd just come from to a door at the far end. The prints seemed fresh, no layer of dust settled back onto them. Worse, they were disjointed, as if the maker's gait was limping or shuffling. My mouth went dry. Wait, Reggie said. We didn't walk there. Then who? A female moan filtered through the door, muffled but painfully human. We exchanged uncertain looks. Every rational part of me screamed to turn back, but ignoring a cry for help felt impossible. Erica, steeling her nerves, led the way. She turned the knob slowly, and we slipped into the next room. It was a small parlor with a battered chaise lounge and an ornate mirror on the wall. Faint lamplight flickered from a corroded sconce. And there, in the corner, stood a figure, her back to us, shoulders trembling. She wore a pale nightgown, torn at the hem, revealing bare feet coated in dust. Her hair hung in tangled strands. Gabe inhaled sharply. "Ma'am? Are you lost?" No response. She stood unnaturally still. I inched closer, fighting the urge to flee. "We can help you," I said softly, "if you—" She turned. The face was wrong. Her eyes were empty sockets, black voids that threatened to swallow my consciousness. Her mouth hung open in a silent wail. Then, with a shudder, she vanished, collapsing into a swirl of dust that dissipated in the stale air. A single sob echoed, as though the building itself was grieving. My knees buckled. If Andre hadn't caught my elbow, I'd have collapsed. Gabe's mouth worked soundlessly, trying to form words. Erica took a step backward and stumbled against Reggie, who himself looked an inch from hysteria. That was a ghost, Reggie managed to say, voice cracking. For the first time, Gabe had nothing sarcastic to offer. He just nodded, pale. When we finally found a corridor that didn't dead end, we realized we were near a side veranda, another blocked-off area, but potentially an exit. The door out to the veranda was sealed by heavy beams, hammered in place. Our flashlights caught a glimpse of night sky through cracks in the boards. We heard distant traffic, a maddening reminder that normal life existed just beyond these cursed walls. Without a better plan, we turned around to explore an adjacent library, yes, another library. The mansion was a labyrinth of corridors and hidden rooms, each more unsettling than the last. This library had slanted shelves stuffed with yet more old tomes. The reading tables were layered in dust. At the far end, I noticed a large desk with an ancient ledger spread open. The ledger's pages were yellowed, the ink faded. My eyes scanned the text, names, dates, bizarre notations referencing appointments or consultations. Sarah Winchester's name appeared multiple times, each entry accompanied by cryptic references like seance, 2 a.m., or communion with John, protective arrangement. The final pages mentioned a dark entity seeking vengeance, requiring elaborate wards to keep it imprisoned. "We awakened something," Andre said, voice trembling. "This wing of the mansion must have been sealed off to contain. I don't even know what." Erica's hands shook as she turned another page. Sarah Winchester was haunted by guilt, and by something else, something older than the ghosts of gun victims. She tried to appease them with constant construction, but apparently there were also rituals. Reggie flipped through a smaller notebook beside the ledger. "Looks like instructions for maintaining a set of symbols and wards. The circle we found must be key. If it's not renewed periodically, the entity gets stronger." A distant slam resounded, like a door banging shut. Then came footsteps overhead, heavy, determined. We huddled close, every muscle tense. The footsteps passed, heading somewhere else. I drew a shaky breath. "We need to fix the circle," I said, surprising even myself with how certain I sounded. "Those books said something about the circle's power. If it's broken." "We're all in danger," Gabe finished. Andre nodded grimly. "Let's do it. Then we get out." We had no choice but to trace our way back to the forbidden room, the one with the carved symbol on the floor. Even though it was sealed, perhaps we could find another route in. Anxiety climbed as we navigated corridors that seemed to shift around us, echoing with phantom footsteps and muffled whispers. The house felt alive, throbbing with malevolent energy. At last, we stumbled upon a narrow flight of stairs that slanted downward. The air grew stagnant as we descended, and I realized we might be heading beneath the forbidden room, perhaps a basement or sublevel. We emerged into a cramped space with stone walls and a low ceiling. A single archway led into what looked like an underground hallway. Water dripped, forming puddles on the floor. We followed the hallway until it curved gently upward, culminating in another door. Gabe tried the knob. It opened to a swirling cloud of dust, revealing the very room we sought. We recognized the shelves of old books, the circle etched into the floor. The circle, however, was marred by a jagged crack in the wood. The damage looked fresh, as though someone had struck it with a heavy tool. The air felt heavier here. My ears rang with an unseen pressure, like standing too close to a roaring waterfall. The temperature plummeted. I spotted faint flickers of shadow movement from the corners of my vision. We shuffled inside, hearts in our throats. "How do we fix it?" Reggie asked, hugging himself for warmth. Erica opened the ritual notebook, scanning a page with trembling lips. "We need to redraw the broken lines with blood?" She looked up in horror. "It says we have to restore the circle using a living sacrifice if necessary." My stomach lurched. "No. We're not harming anyone." Andre's face tightened. "We just need a bit of blood, right? Not a full sacrifice. We can do that if it's enough to seal this thing." Gabe paled. "If we do that, are we sure it'll work?" We had no other plan. The air thickened, oppressive. The walls groaned, the overhead beams creaked. It felt like the entire house was converging on us. Outside, footsteps echoed, lots of them, as though a legion of unseen watchers were massing. Andre borrowed a small knife from Gabe's pack. "Everyone, just give a little." We lined up at the circle's edge. Carefully, we pricked our fingertips, letting droplets of crimson fall onto the carved lines. The ancient grooves seemed to absorb the blood, darkening. Erica guided us from the instructions. We chanted half-intelligible words, Latin or something older. Per sanguinem nostram claudimus ostium. Per voluntatem nostram vincimus tenebris. Our voices trembled. At first, nothing happened. Then the circle itself seemed to glow faintly, the lines radiating a dull light that pulsed in time with my racing heart. The walls shuddered. A gust of cold wind swept through the room, flattening our hair to our foreheads. The books on the shelves rattled violently. All at once, a banshee-like scream tore through the air. My flashlight flickered wildly, revealing in its strobing beam half-formed shadows lunging at us from the perimeter. They flickered like incomplete images from a broken projector, howling in rage or despair. Something invisible slammed into me, knocking me off balance. I scrambled to my feet, blood hammering in my veins. "Keep chanting," Erica yelled over the noise. We did, forcing the words out past chattering teeth. The spectral assault intensified, but the circle's glow brightened, repelling them. The battered wood beneath our feet felt like it might give way, but we stood firm. One by one, the phantoms recoiled, drawn back from the edges of the light, their shrieks diminishing to whimpers. And then, with a final hiss, they vanished. The glow dimmed, fading into the normal gloom of the room. We collapsed, panting, adrenaline raging through our systems. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a weary stillness. Minutes or hours passed, it was hard to tell. We regained our composure in silence, each lost in a swirl of disbelief and relief. The circle on the floor had resumed a calm, faint glow, as though newly sealed. The tension that gripped the mansion's corridors seemed to have eased. When we cautiously opened the door to the hallway, it swung free without resistance. The route back was strangely clear. The doors that had been sealed, or led to nowhere, now offered a straightforward path to the mansion's main section. Not a single door slammed on its own, no footsteps dogged us, no laughter scratched at our nerves. The old house felt dormant. At last, we emerged into the better-lit portion of the Winchester house, where faint voices of the cleaning staff drifted from the front entrance. We shared a glance, no one would believe what we'd been through. We slipped out a side door, hearts still pounding. Outside, the night sky twinkled with stars. Crisp air filled my lungs, a welcome contrast to the stale indoors. A quick glance at our phones showed multiple missed calls, our friends, or perhaps the staff. We wanted to vanish before security found us. We hopped a low fence, scurried down a block, and only then did we stop to breathe and attempt to piece together what had happened. None of us emerged unscathed. Over the following weeks, nightmares haunted our sleep. We remembered that ghostly woman in the dusty parlor, the swirl of malevolent shadows, the unnatural weight of centuries pressing down in that hidden room. Erica threw herself into deciphering the Latin fragments we'd copied, becoming reclusive and jumpy. Gabe tried to bury the experience under jokes, but his forced laughter betrayed anxiety. Reggie, always the quiet one, barely spoke at all. Andre claimed we'd done a service to the house, sealed the evil, but I saw the guilt in his eyes. He'd led us there. As for me, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear faint footsteps pacing outside my bedroom door. The memory of that heavy hush in the Winchester house creeps back, and I wonder if we truly sealed whatever lurked in the mansion's shadows, or if we merely fed it enough to satisfy it for now. We never talked publicly about what we witnessed, never gave any official statements. The few pictures on Gabe's phone came out blurred or blank, as though the entity had devoured the images. We parted ways for a while, each wrestling with secrets too heavy to share. Now, I'm penning this account in the hope that someone who reads it will understand the hidden corners of the Winchester Mystery House aren't just empty rooms. They contain stories older and darker than any brochure or historian snippet might convey. If you decide to visit, be wary of straying from the guided paths. Doors that should remain locked were sealed for a reason. And if you stumble upon a hidden corridor or a boarded-up wing, remember our story. Because sometimes, the dead don't want to rest, and even centuries after she's gone, Sarah Winchester's labyrinth of guilt and spirits might still be hungry for new souls. I can't say for certain whether the house is truly cleansed. But I know one thing: if you ever hear footsteps in an abandoned corridor, or see a door open by itself in that twisted mansion, turn around and leave. Some secrets are better left in the dark, locked away from prying eyes and beating hearts. Once awakened, the Winchester Mansion's curse clings to you like dust that no amount of rational thought can shake. And the next time the floor creaks under phantom steps, you'll wonder whether it's just an echo, or the house calling you back to finish what was started so long ago. Story number 3. The Desert's Silent Call. My first glimpse of the little house in Death Valley felt like the opening scene of some old western: wide open sky, endless desert stretching out in all directions, and a lonely shack half buried in the dust. I remember stepping out of our Jeep into a gust of cold desert air, grains of sand prickling my cheeks, and thinking, it looks haunted. But I pushed that thought away. We'd driven 5 hours from Los Angeles, loaded down with all our worldly possessions, convinced that this isolated speck in the desert could become our private retreat. A place to start over. Eddie, my husband, was the dreamer of the two of us. He stumbled on a real estate listing for a historical gold miner's cabin near Furnace Creek, unbelievably cheap. He pored over photos, adobe walls, a sloping tin roof, and a porch propped up by brittle wooden posts. "We'll renovate," he told me, eyes lit up. "Make it our secret getaway. It's perfect for writing, painting, anything." I was skeptical at first, but the place tugged at my curiosity, plus we were both tired of big city stress. It was a chance to escape, to find ourselves in the hush of the desert. We arrived in early winter, hoping the mild desert chill would be easier than the brutal summer. By day, the temperature was brisk but tolerable. By night, it fell sharply, as if the desert wanted to remind us we were intruders. The house stood at the end of a dirt track that seemed to emerge from nowhere and vanish into rocky hills behind us. No neighbors for miles, just a scattering of distant cacti and a horizon bleached pale by the midday sun. Eddie unlocked the front door with a triumphant grin. Stepping inside, we found a single-story layout, a main room with a rickety table, a small kitchen alcove, a narrow bedroom off to one side, and a closet that turned out to be more like a cramped storage space. The walls were thick adobe, promising insulation from the extremes of day and night. An ancient wood stove squatted in one corner, and a single dusty window faced east, welcoming the morning light. It was sparse, old, and definitely in need of TLC. Yet I felt an odd fondness immediately. The place seemed to whisper, "I'm yours, if you can handle me." I ran my palm over the battered tabletop, noticing strange notches carved along the edges, patterns like tally marks or half-faded shapes. Eddie hauled in our suitcases, his breath puffing in the cool interior. We decided to set up an inflatable mattress for now, planning to bring in a real bed later. That night, we huddled under blankets, marveling at the absolute silence outside. No distant traffic, no neighbors yelling. Just the wind sighing across the desert. On our second day, we began cleaning out the neglected corners. The house had come furnished, if you can call a few broken chairs and a battered wooden chest furnished. The chest was wedged in the bedroom closet, its hinges rusted solid. Eddie pried it open with a crowbar, and we discovered the first hint that this cabin had a deeper story than we realized. Inside were old papers, bound together with a strip of cracked leather. The pages were yellowed, edges crumbling, and scrawled with a loose script. A name repeated in the margins, D. Carver. Leafing through, we saw rough sketches of mining equipment, half-finished letters, and journal entries marked by short, frantic sentences. January 3, 1910, heard them again last night. Whispers along the ridge. Ain't no coyotes. If I ignore them, they get louder. January 5th, my boy says he sees figures near the well at dusk. Tall silhouettes. They vanish when I approach. January 9th, something's wrong with the ore. It glitters even when there's no light. The others want me to keep digging, but I feel we've stirred something that wants to stay buried. The hairs on my arms rose. I flipped further and found more references to strange sightings. January 15th, the nights grow colder. Mary can't sleep. She hears them tapping on the walls. I told her she's dreaming, but it's no dream. My boy cries out in the dark, saying the shadows want him to come outside. January 20th, we tried to move, but each time the wagon breaks, the horse goes lame, something always stops us. Are we cursed? The final lines were barely legible, scrawled with a trembling hand. They want us to stay. They want more than we can give. Eddie and I exchanged uneasy looks. So, maybe this Carver guy was losing his mind, he suggested. Hallucinating from isolation, or maybe the mercury used in mining messed him up. I nodded, swallowing. That must be it. But the pit of my stomach churned. We were, after all, in the same house. The winter desert nights could do strange things to people. Still, we decided to keep the papers, hoping they'd add some historical flair to our new home story. Maybe we'd frame a few pages or write an article about it. That evening, a chill settled in as the sun dipped below the craggy horizon. We lit the wood stove, grateful for its warmth. Outside, a wind kicked up, swirling the sand against the windows in faint rattling pulses. The sky turned a bruised purple, then an oceanic black dotted with stars. We made soup on a portable propane burner, sipped it by lantern light, and tried to joke about the spookiness of the journal. Yet I kept glancing at the door, half expecting to see a tall silhouette leaning against it from the outside. Eventually, we went to bed. Eddie's breathing lulled me into a drowsy calm, and I drifted off. Sometime in the early hours, though, I snapped awake with the sense that something was in the room with us. My eyes adjusted to the gloom. Our blankets lay tangled, the shadows cast by the wood stove's dying embers crawled across the walls. The house was silent. Yet I felt watched, as if an unseen figure stood by the foot of the bed, studying us. I barely slept after that. The next day, I asked Eddie if he'd heard anything. He shrugged it off, but his eyes didn't meet mine. The temperature stayed low all morning, and we huddled in jackets while trying to fix a leak in the roof. By midday, the desert sun emerged, and we ventured outside to explore the property. The deed included a few acres of land, plus an old well, now filled in with rocks, and a collapsed shack that might have been a tool shed. It was near the rusted remains of a windmill that I found footprints in the sand. Not ours, not fresh either, but they seemed odd. Too large, spaced too far apart. Almost as if something with elongated strides had walked around the area. The footprints led off into the desert before vanishing where the wind had blown them away. I squinted into the distance. Nothing but rolling dunes and a horizon that quivered under the midday heat. An uneasy feeling settled in me, an echo of Carver's journals. Tall silhouettes. My heart thudded. Back inside, we tinkered with a shortwave radio, hoping to catch local weather updates or amuse ourselves with static-laden stations. The reception was poor. I turned a dial, searching for a clear frequency. For a moment, there was a burst of crackling, and then a faint voice, garbled. I froze. It sounded like a single word repeated, but I couldn't decipher it. Then the signal died, replaced by static. Desert radio weirdness? Eddie offered with a thin smile. Atmospheric conditions can bounce signals from hundreds of miles away. I nodded, but my nerves frayed. Something about this place was wrong. The silence outside felt charged with presence, as if the desert itself were alive and curious about us. On our fourth day, the real nightmares began. We'd spent the evening reading more of Carver's journal by lamplight. He'd written about the intense hush that enveloped the desert after sundown, describing how even the usual rustle of animals or wind would go eerily still. Then came the faint footsteps around the house. Tap, tap, tap. On nights with a full moon, he claimed to see figures crossing the ridges, black outlines that seemed to watch him. We just closed the journal when a muffled thud shook the wall. Eddie jumped up, grabbing a flashlight. I followed him to the front porch. The desert lay still, silvered under a moon nearing fullness. A scattering of stones or debris lay near the porch steps, as if someone had tossed them against the side of the house. But there was nobody around. We scanned the horizon with the flashlight, seeing only brush and shadows. As we turned to go back in, I noticed something, an outline in the sand, wide as a human torso, but elongated. My skin prickled. Then the wind gusted, obliterating the shape. From that night on, every time we tried to sleep, we heard faint, rhythmic knocks. Sometimes it was a scraping along the outside walls. Other times it was a distant moaning that might have been the wind, but didn't quite sound like it. I found myself sitting up in bed, hard hammering, clinging to Eddie's arm while he stared at the ceiling, face set in grim tension. "We can leave," he said finally, one morning after a particularly sleepless night. "But we only just got here," I replied, though my voice shook. "We spent our savings on this place." He pressed his hands to his temples. "I'm starting to think it was a mistake. Something's just not right." I nodded, torn between pride and fear. Over the next day, we tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it was just desert animals, or our own paranoia fueled by Carver's journal. We told ourselves we'd tough it out a little longer. That evening, I lit the lantern and decided to read more of the old notes. Perhaps there was an explanation or solution hidden among Carver's scribbles. Eddie sat beside me, peering over my shoulder. My finger traced a passage referencing the shining ore, apparently found in a mineshaft nearby. Carver wrote, "We dug deeper than we should." The ore glowed under the lantern's light. Doc Martin said it reeked of some toxic deposit, but it's more than that. The dogs ran away, howling. Next day, I found strange footprints near the mouth of the shaft. Mary begs me to fill it back in. I want to, but the others insist we keep mining. The next page detailed how the family started seeing night visitors. Lights drifted across the desert, and the dogs never stopped barking at them. Carver and his wife attempted to pack their wagon to leave, but each time, some disaster prevented them: broken wheels, missing horses, storms that came out of nowhere. The final entry ended abruptly. "Our boy's gone." We heard him cry out. We found the door wide open, footprints leading away. The desert took him. Tomorrow, we're leaving no matter what. Pray God spares us from the watchers in the dark. Eddie closed the book, exhaling shakily. "So they tried to go, but..." My voice cracked. "I guess we don't know if they made it." From the text, it sounds like something out there didn't want them leaving. We exchanged a long, fearful look. The next morning, Eddie suggested we do exactly what Carver's family couldn't. "Let's pack. We can find a cheap motel in Pahrump or Beatty, figure out what to do next. This place is obviously messing with our heads." I was relieved. Even though it felt like giving up, I couldn't stand another night under that roof, listening to ghostly knocks and imagining phantom silhouettes. We hurried to gather clothes, stashed some belongings in the Jeep. The moment we tried to start the engine, though, it made a sputtering cough and died. Eddie popped the hood. The battery connections looked fine, the fluids were normal. He tried again. Nothing. We stared at each other in dread. "We just had this thing serviced a month ago," he muttered. I patted his shoulder, trying to calm him. The nearest mechanic was over 50 miles away. And no cell signal meant we couldn't just call for help. Our hopes of an easy escape evaporated. We were stuck, at least until we could figure out how to fix the Jeep or contact someone. I suggested we walk to the main road, 8 miles away, and flagged down a passing car. But Eddie's face tightened. Maybe tomorrow. The weather says a storm front might roll in tonight. We don't want to be caught on foot in a sudden sandstorm or freeze after dark. Reluctantly, we trudged back into the cabin, hearts heavy. The day's light bled away, leaving the sky streaked with crimson and gold. We made a small meal, hardly tasting it. My stomach churned with anxiety as the sun dipped below the horizon. Darkness cloaked the desert once more. That night was different, colder, quieter. Even the usual wind seemed to hold its breath. Eddie and I lay in bed, stiff with tension. By midnight, I'd almost convinced myself maybe we'd get some rest, maybe the eerie disturbances would skip tonight. Then a new sound drifted in, thump, scratch, thump. It was on the roof. My mind flashed to Carver's mention of footsteps on the roof. Eddie grabbed a flashlight. "Stay here," he whispered, voice shaky. "Are you kidding me?" I breathed. "I'm not letting you go alone." We crept into the main room. The scratching continued overhead, accompanied by an occasional bump. I felt a surge of terror imagining some creature slithering across the tin roof. Eddie used the flashlight to peer through the window facing the yard. Nothing but darkness. Then a shadow drifted across the moonlit patch of sand, tall and crooked. I froze, nails digging into Eddie's arm. A faint, inhuman moan seeped through the walls. We saw a second silhouette flicker by, almost gliding. My pulse roared in my ears. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. Eddie gasped. It was turning from the outside. Click, click. The door was locked, but I feared that might not matter. We braced ourselves, every nerve on edge. The rattling stopped. Then a heavy thud slammed into the door, making the entire frame shudder. Another moan, closer now. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. Eddie backed away, rummaging for something. He grabbed a crowbar from near the chest. We had no gun, no real weapon. Next came a scraping along the side of the house. My mind conjured an image of skeletal fingers dragging nails across the adobe. Another slam against the door. The hinges groaned. Then, as swiftly as it started, everything went still. We waited, breath hitching. The silence seemed worse than the banging. Finally, Eddie tiptoed to the door, pressing an ear against it. "Gone," he mouthed. Before we could relax, a thunderous crash echoed from the bedroom. We rushed in, panicked. The window was shattered from the outside, shards of glass on the floor. Cold night air flooded in. In the gloom, I spotted a shape. It looked like a man's outline, but too tall, limbs elongated like a marionette's. My flashlight flickered over it. For a heartbeat, it remained there, colorless eyes locked on me. Its mouth gaped in a silent scream. Then it melted back out the window as if dissolving into the darkness. "Oh, God," Eddie whispered, voice breaking. "What was that?" I couldn't speak. My head swam, knees trembling. This was no coyote or desert drifter, it was something else. Something Carver warned about. The watchers that needed us to stay. We barricaded the broken window with furniture, hearts hammering. The entire house felt under siege. We realized we couldn't just wait it out. We had to run. Even if it meant trekking across miles of desert at night. But as we gathered flashlights and supplies, a monstrous wind rose outside. Sand battered the walls, the windows rattled in their frames. Through the bedroom's shattered pane, I saw swirling dust devils illuminated by moonlight. The desert had unleashed a storm. My hope of fleeing on foot evaporated. We'd be blinded out there, lost in a tempest, easy prey for whatever roamed the dunes. We huddled in the main room, crouched beside the flickering lantern, the Jeep's broken ignition key in my pocket. The wind roared, drowning out any other noise. The walls shook, and I feared they might collapse. Hours dragged by. I clung to Eddie, wishing for dawn. Dreams flickered behind my closed eyes, Carver's boy, lost in the sands, calling for help that never came. At some point, I must have drifted into a half-sleep. I woke to a hush. The storm had quieted. My watch read 5 a.m., still dark. Eddie dozed fitfully. I heard a faint scuffling near the porch. Summoning courage, I tiptoed to the door, listening. Another scuffle. Then a soft knock, 4 taps in slow succession. Knock, 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 knock. My blood turned to ice. Who's out there? I pressed my ear to the wood. A whisper seeped through the crack. It sounded like a child's voice, Mama? A chill raced down my spine. Was this some monstrous trick? Mama, came the whisper again. A child's sob, heartbreakingly real. I backed away, tears blurring my vision. Carver's child? Or some desert spirit mimicking a lost boy? Eddie stirred awake. I mouthed, outside. Child's voice. He went pale. We braced ourselves, each clutching a flashlight. Stay behind me, he said. We unlatched the door, inching it open. Dawn's earliest glow revealed the porch steps. Sand coated everything, shaped into fresh drifts by the storm. No child, no footprints. We scanned the yard. Nothing. Then, to our left, we glimpsed a fleeting figure behind the collapsed windmill. It looked small, maybe child-sized, wrapped in ragged cloth. Eddie started forward, but I grabbed his arm. Don't, I whispered. It's a trick. He hesitated, then the figure vanished behind the structure. We couldn't stay here, that much was clear. Our Jeep might be dead, but we had no choice except to try fixing it or attempt the trek to the main road in daylight. Eddie rummaged through the cabin, looking for spare parts or something to jumpstart the engine. Meanwhile, I pored over Carver's final entries again, searching for some clue about how his family escaped, if they ever did. The last page offered a cryptic note. We gather all we can, but the Watchers circle. Mary believes a sacrifice is needed to appease them, an offering of what we value most. I cannot allow it. We'll run at dawn. If we fail, the desert keeps us forever. Nothing else. My breath caught. Mary believed a sacrifice was needed. Did that mean she? A wave of nausea overtook me. These Watchers, or whatever they were, had forced that family to do something unthinkable. And we might be next. Could the Watchers want us to replicate some horrific act? Was that the only way to break their hold? I found Eddie in the yard, tinkering under the Jeep's hood. Batteries totally drained. The wiring's messed up, too. It's like something tore out a chunk of the harness. He showed me ragged cables. We're not going anywhere. I stared bleakly at the horizon, a desert of bleached bone. The Watchers, the house, the swirling sand, it all conspired to trap us. We'll walk, then, I said hoarsely. Load backpacks with water, food. We'll have to hope we can beat the next storm. He nodded, exhaling. Let's do it soon, before nightfall. Around noon, the desert sun brought a harsh glare. We donned hats, loaded a few gallons of water, some snacks, flashlights. The main highway lay roughly 8 miles east. We planned to follow a compass bearing. The Watchers seemed less active by daylight. Maybe we could slip away. Ready? Eddie murmured, his eyes hard with determination. I nodded. We locked the cabin out of habit, though I doubted any door would keep out those beings. Then we trudged across the sand, boots crunching on gravel. Each step took us farther from the cursed house. My legs felt heavy, as if wading through reluctant air. For the first mile, the desert remained eerily calm. No strange noises, no silhouettes flickering at the edges of sight. My hope rose. Maybe we could outrun the Watchers. We pressed on, tongues growing dry despite frequent sips of water. By mile 3, the midday sun blazed overhead, sapping our strength. Sweat beaded on my forehead, dripped down my neck. The terrain grew more uneven, rocky outcrops interrupting the sand. Our pace slowed. Occasionally, Eddie checked the compass, and we corrected course. The cabin was just a speck behind us. Then, near a cluster of boulders, Eddie stopped abruptly. Hear that? A scraping sound from somewhere ahead. We crouched behind a rock, scanning the land. My heart pounded. Eventually, we saw a figure kneeling in the sand, maybe 50 yards away. It was definitely human-shaped, wearing tattered clothes. Its arms were braced on the ground, head bowed. I thought it might be an injured traveler, but something about the posture was off, unnaturally stiff. Eddie motioned for us to circle around quietly. We stepped carefully, but halfway through, the figure snapped upright. I stifled a scream. Its face was hidden by shadows, though daylight surrounded us. Then it rose with a swift, fluid motion, far too nimble to be normal. Eddie tugged my arm, and we bolted. We ran blindly, adrenaline surging. The desert floor wavered under the punishing sun. I glimpsed shapes moving in the corners of my vision, more watchers, black silhouettes slithering behind ridges. The urge to look back pounded in my skull, but fear urged me forward. We sprinted until my lungs burned, until a wave of dizziness overcame me. Eddie grabbed my shoulders, steadying me. "We have to keep going," he rasped. But my body rebelled, legs trembling. We found a partial shade behind a jagged boulder, slumping down to catch our breath. My ears rang. The sun hammered down mercilessly. Time blurred. Eventually, I noticed a stillness, no watchers immediately in view. Eddie checked the compass. His expression darkened. "We're off course. We ran too far north." I nearly sobbed. Another hour, maybe two, and the sun would sink. We'd be stuck in the open desert at night. "We can't go back," I whispered. "They'll be waiting." His eyes were bloodshot, lips cracked. "We'll try anyway. Maybe we can angle southeast, find the road." "We have to." We trudged on, half delirious. The sun dropped, painting the sky in orange and purple. My feet felt like lead, throat parched despite rationing water. Eddie's breathing rattled. We saw no watchers, but dread weighed on us. As the last sliver of daylight vanished, the temperature plunged. I fumbled for a flashlight, hands shaking. A rocky ridge loomed ahead. Eddie suggested we climb it, see if we could spot lights from the highway. We scrambled up the slope, nearly collapsing at the top. The sky brimmed with stars, and the desert stretched in all directions, shadow upon shadow. No sign of traffic or civilization. Panic set in. Then I heard the moaning wind. A faint glow flickered below, a swirl of dust, or maybe a phantom light. My mind conjured illusions. Eddie squeezed my hand. "We have to find shelter." But the only shelter was the house we'd fled. The watchers had effectively driven us in circles, ensuring we couldn't escape. "We're going to die out here," I choked, tears burning my eyes. "No," Eddie whispered, jaw clenched. "We'll survive. We can keep moving until dawn." Night advanced, bringing a cruel chill. My bones ached. We stumbled across the desert floor, guided by a dim flashlight beam that illuminated drifting sands. Every so often, I sensed movement on the periphery, a pale figure or a shadow too tall to be human. My heart hammered with terror, but we pressed on, each step a battle. Hours must have passed. Then I heard a whisper, "This way." I froze, shining the flashlight around. Eddie's eyes widened, he'd heard it too. The voice repeated, gentle but urgent, "This way." It seemed to drift from the south, the direction of the house. "It's luring us back," Eddie hissed. But we were half dead with exhaustion, no idea where the main road was. The watchers had cornered us, left us no option. "Maybe we should go," I said, voice shaking. "Carver's family tried to fight it and failed. Maybe we fixed something undone." Eddie stared at me, torn. Finally, we trudged south, following the voice. The watchers seemed to recede, letting us pass. Anxiety twisted my gut. We were playing into their hands, returning to the cursed place. Yet our only hope of survival lay in the house's meager shelter. It felt like we walked for eternity. At last, the cabin's silhouette appeared in the moonlight, a lonely shape against the hills. Relief and dread mingled in my chest. The front door hung open, as though expecting us. A wave of cold air blew out. We slipped inside, battered and trembling. The interior was silent, the broken window letting in a faint draft. Everything looked just as we'd left it, except for footprints in the dust, shaped like elongated feet leading to the bedroom. We followed them, hearts pounding. The footprints ended at a corner where Carver's chest once lay. The chest was still there, lid ajar. Inside, the journal lay open to the final page. Another set of footprints, child-sized, led away, vanishing at the wall. My breath hitched. The watchers were inside, or had been, beckoning us to see something. I knelt by the chest, flipping the battered pages. My eyes fell on an entry we'd overlooked. If they demand a life, I cannot. We must remain or lose ourselves. The desert ties us here with invisible chains. Despair washed over me. The watchers thrived on this place. They demanded a sacrifice that Carver refused. But what if that refusal sealed his fate? Eddie placed a shaking hand on my shoulder. We can't give them a child we don't have, he whispered. So, do we remain? A scraping noise sounded from the front room. We jumped up. Standing in the gloom was that tall shape again, a silhouette of a man, or something that once was a man. Its limbs bent unnaturally, and its face was a void. My heart stuttered. The figure raised a hand, beckoning. Terrified, we followed it to the center of the main room. My flashlight flickered off. The temperature plummeted further. Then, with a shudder, the silhouette merged into the dark. I heard a soft crying sound from nowhere and everywhere. They want us to stay, I whispered, tears sliding down my cheeks. Eddie's face twisted with defiance. No. We break the cycle. He grabbed a lighter from his pocket. We burn the house. The watchers hold us here because this place is their anchor. Carver wrote about it or deposit in the walls or something. Maybe if we destroy it. I stared. Could that work? If the watchers were tied to the property, destroying it might free us. Or kill us. But we were out of options. Yes. Let's do it. We rushed around, gathering anything flammable, scraps of wood, old furniture, bedding, doused in lamp oil. The watchers stirred, a series of heavy knocks pounded on the walls. The moaning rose, rattling our nerves. But we pressed on, trembling with adrenaline and fear. Eddie sparked his lighter. The flame danced, trembling in the cold draft. He touched it to an oil-soaked rag. Fire leapt up. We threw the rag onto the pile, which ignited with a roar. The watchers shrieked, an unearthly wail that made me clamp my hands over my ears. The house lit up in an infernal glow, shadows twisting across the walls. Smoke poured into the room, choking us. We scrambled outside, coughing. Flames licked through the windows, devouring the cabin from within. The watchers' silhouettes flickered in the inferno, writhing, howling in some inhuman chorus. My eyes brimmed with tears from the smoke, or maybe sorrow for the old house and Carver's lost family. The desert wind carried sparks into the night sky. We stood back, hearts pounding, watching the house collapse, logs crumbling into embers. The watchers thrashed in the flames, dissolving into sparks. A final roar, then a rush of heat. The structure caved in on itself, leaving a glowing heap. As the flames died down, an eerie hush settled. No more knocks, no moans. The watchers were gone, or so I prayed. Dawn found us exhausted, battered, but alive. The Jeep, left near the front yard, now sat dusted in ash. But guess what? When Eddie tried the ignition, it coughed to life. A glitch of fate or the watcher's final release. We drove away under the soft morning sun, the desert behind us. I glanced in the rearview mirror at the blackened ruins. A swirl of dust seemed to form a child's shape, then faded. My chest tightened, but I refused to stop. We kept going until we hit the main road, then beyond. Months have passed. We rented an apartment back in the city. Sometimes I wake up from nightmares of tall silhouettes crossing the desert, of a child crying out. Eddie struggles too, haunted by guilt and doubt. Did we do the right thing, or just unleash something into the wind? Carver's journal sits in a safe deposit box, the only relic we salvaged from that place. The final page remains burned into my memory. Pray God spares us from the watchers in the dark. I think we saved ourselves. Or maybe we just ended up enacting another cycle of destruction that the desert demanded. Death Valley stands there still, an endless, silent land under the harsh sun. People drive by on their way to see the salt flats, the canyons, the dunes, never knowing about a lonely cabin that once stood there, or the watchers that roamed its night. But I know. And so does Eddie. The desert doesn't forget, nor does it forgive. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind rattles my window in the city, I recall the hush of that desert dawn, the moment we realized we had broken free. Then I wonder if perhaps the watchers still linger in some hidden corner, waiting for the next soul to bury itself in the sand, the next family to answer the desert's silent call. Because in Death Valley, the boundaries between the living and the lost are thin as a thread of gold, shimmering in the dusty twilight. And once you hear that silent call, a piece of you remains there forever, entombed in the shifting dunes, haunted by the watchers who never truly die.